Hey everybody, it's Chase. I'm back with the video that I promised or talked about last week. I'm here tonight with Bracken.
I am not a sentient talking penguin.
Third time he's got to use that tonight because we've had technical issues. Technical issues abound tonight. So I'm going to leave my mouse on the screen because that seems to be working best for my video not freezing up. His video's been having issues, so we're going to do the long form and hopefully it turns out okay. And if it doesn't, then we're just
We've done our best.
we've done our best. So, what we plan on doing tonight is talking about writing and the writing process. We're going to talk about his novels, my novels. Um, we both have reference material off screen, so we're not going to be necessarily staring into the camera. Uh,
Well, technically, mine is on screen.
yeah, his is on screen, mine is off screen, so I won't be staring at unless I put it up here. I can put my laptop up here and stare as close, I guess. But yeah, tonight the general goal is to talk about writing and the writing process, to talk a little bit about how we do it, uh, kind of differences. Because the great thing about this, and I think the reason why this is going to be so very very useful, is that Bracken and I have a very very different writing process.
We do.
Um, for the most part, I tend to be what a lot of writers call a pantster. Um, I am not a planner. Well, I'm a planster. I got that one off of Twitter recently. Is I kind of plan a little bit, but like 90% of my writing is pantsing it all the way through to the end. It makes my editing process and revising process quite a bit longer. And Bracken, tell us a little bit about your process.
So, actually, in a way, I'm a bit of a plantster too, but I probably take much more of a methodical approach to it. So, I have an outline, and my outlines go down to within each chapter. Uh, but within that framework, I kind of just say, "Welcome to the playground, kids. Do your thing as long as you obey the rules." And that's fun for me because even though I'm putting a lot of effort into planning, my characters often surprise me in what they're trying to do to get there. And I think in a way has actually helped me write them better than if I had planned them all the way through.
And that's a really good point because most of my pansteringness. Yeah, we're going with all the fake words as
Yeah,
writers
sure.
tonight. So all of my kind of like spontaneous writing comes out of the fact that my characters, what winds up happening is I wind up getting through the first 20,000 words of the work. It's all kind of planned out. I get through the first 20,000 words, and then I get into kind of the second act of my novels, and my characters go, "Nah, I'm not doing that." And so I get this really terrible kind of like, I can force my characters to do these things that they've staunchly refused to do, or I can say, well, what do you want to do instead?
Yeah.
It's like basically I'm playing D&D with myself at that point. Is my characters kind of go off the rails and they do what they want, and it's created some very interesting kind of things in my novels. Um, Things I never really expected. I mean, I've had characters, go in a completely different direction than I expected them to. I've had characters turn out to be very different than I expected them to be.
Yeah.
I've had whole plot lines kind of go out the window because of what a character decided they weren't going to do. So it's kind of a.
Sure. And that, I think there's like a technical term for this that is called like discovery writing, which is kind of like
Oh,
what
I
you're
thought you
doing a
were going to say
lot,
schizophrenia.
or that. No, so my main character actually preceded the story. Uh, and the interesting thing for me is I had a clear image of what she looked like. She's actually the one on the screen. I had a clear image of what she looked like uh,
Which,
before I went
sorry
into
to
this.
cut in, but I was going to mention earlier, I was going to say, is that Katie Stackoff on your screen? Because it's
Kind of.
kind
I
of
mean,
a.
she was the base model. There
Okay.
were two base models for her. Katie Sackhoff was one of them. But I went into it with a clear idea of what she looked like, but I wasn't informed about why she looked like she did. It was kind of just a general set of features that said, I like this. Um, and then in the process of writing the story, at various points, she's like, "Oh yeah, I have this for a reason, and this tattoo means this, and I got these scars from this." I'm like, "Okay, that's great," because I had no idea.
And that yeah, and that's what's really interesting about characters is that I the first book I ever wrote, my favorite character out of the entire book series was actually a secondary mercenary character. Her name was Kyrian, and you know it was kind of this really interesting thing where I had the main character and he was supposed to be like this. It was kind of one of those like the first novel I ever wrote or the first trilogy I ever wrote was insanely cringy. It was very bad. Writing was
Yeah,
terrible. The main character was a snooze fest. And so this character, like she was supposed to basically be, like a one-off for the first book, someone who the main character had to kill to kind of like it was basically like a turning point for the main character.
yeah.
But I was basically like, I can't kill this character off. I brought her back for the second novel, um, you know, and she wound up being a very good deep character. But it was kind of one of those. She was one of those characters that like informed herself. She like started writing her own story, and it always makes me a little bit sad because in every like regardless of how good your novels are and how good your plotting is or how good everything else is, you wind up having certain characters that are very good regardless.
Yeah.
They're the gem in the story that really shines out. They write themselves. They make everything worth moving forward because of the way that they write themselves.
Well, the irony to me is, Wolf, as I call her, which is like her call sign and not her actual name. She started out as way too much of a Mary Sue. Um, so when I got down to brass tacks with really getting serious about the first draft, I told myself I need a foil character to inform her flaws. I need a character that is going to help her fix those Mary Sue tendencies at the same time as reveal that she has an issue with them. Uh, and in a very roundabout way, the foil character and her relationship uh, kind of have become one of the principal themes about the book, which is peculiar to me because I don't like my main character the most in my cast. If I was to put my characters on a ranking system of saying, who's the most original out of my cast, Wolf would not be very high up in that ranking. I mean, she's pretty much got the whole grizzled veteran mo kind of down to a T. They're, from an outsider's perspective, probably more interesting people.
Well, I think that winds up happening, right? Is that you start a book, you start any book with like your main character in mind, and your main character is a very specific person, a very specific tropey type person. Like I recently wrote a cyberpunk. Cyberpunk, she's basically female Deckard. Like
Yeah,
that because that's what I was going for. When I wrote my space opera, the guy is very like tropey space opera male sci-fi hero.
yeah,
And so when you go through all these books, it's the characters that you don't expect that are always the most favorite. I mean, when I wrote my YA novel, the main character, a lot of people were like, she's plain, very boring character. But a lot of people really liked this little alien character that I had made. He's kind of fun. He's my favorite character too. I really liked him, and so it winds up happening with a lot of novels. I could probably go through every single one of the ones that I've written and say, you know, oh, I like this character more than the main character because, you know, they don't have to be on the same quest that the main character's on necessarily. They can be in the same group and they can be doing the same types of things. But what winds up happening is since they're their own character and they have their own unique past that's not tied to this central story, they can be more interesting because they're not bound by the hero's calling, right?
right.
So that's
Yeah, so as the story evolved and really going into the second draft, which is basically a rewrite with characters from the first draft
which
or the
which I
second
do
draft.
wanna I do wanna preface that before you continue, and I'm sorry to butt in because I think this is very important. And you probably won't talk about it too much yourself. One of the really interesting things about this story is that um, you know, and I'll let you talk about this, but I wanted to bring it up because I want you to talk about this a little bit. Is that the basis for the story was actually Star Wars fan fiction,
Yep,
and it,
that's how it started.
and I think that's a very important distinction and point to make. And the reason why is because I think there's I think there is a lot of merit to starting with, like baseline, reference, right? For
Well,
your
yeah, I mean,
story, it's sorry, go ahead.
it's a formula. It works, So it's hard to go wrong, and you can only improve on it.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of merit to that. I think it's worth mentioning because even though it started as Star Wars fan fiction, I mean, there's other books like what 50 Shades of Grey started as what Twilight fan fiction, right? Like
Yeah.
I think so. So I mean, there's all these different books. I mean, the cyberpunk novel that I wrote is it directly draws 90% of its source material from Blade Runner and the Deus Ex video game series. You
Yeah.
know, because when I wanted to write cyberpunk, my goal was to capture that kind of of world. And I mean, I've had like a few people have read it. Some people really liked it. Some people kind of went, "This is way too familiar." But I think it all comes down to you start with this source material that already has a lot of. So for Star Wars, even though you're going through your second draft, I'm assuming that it still feels very, very. I mean, and I've read. I'm assuming that what you sent me was your second draft.
Yeah. So
So,
far.
so I've read about 20 chapters of it. I haven't
Okay.
gotten into the second set of chapters that you sent me yet.
Yeah.
But despite that, I can still see where it used to be based in a Star Wars type universe. However, like you've put so many of your own touches and so much of the way that you do research has gone into the development of your characters and your world and everything that I could see where it started out, but as a baseline, you've taken that baseline and you've just basically blown it up.
Well, thank you. So, like, the interesting thing for me is when I went into the second draft, I adopted the two person, really kind of three person view of taking a novel. I created a character that was essentially a footnote from the original, and he's become my other main character.
Okay. And the really interesting thing also that I've kind of, I don't want to say struggle because it's not a struggle. It's just a very interesting kind of, it's an interesting read. I believe that the tense you do kind of like a third person omniscient almost. Um
It is kind of and I don't really know all the linguistic hoo ha for you know literary this, literary that, but it is my impression that there's got to be some kind of like in between uh third person limited and third person omniscient because certainly a character can't really tell what's going on in another room. You
yeah.
know,
Yeah.
I do real on the other hand, I really like Russian novels, and I really like that Russian novels will like tear into people's heads and kind of expose that to the world. I love getting I love that kind of psychiatry. And that brings out, and I think in that way it is third person omniscient because I show you what people are thinking.
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the reasons why I moved away from third person limited more towards first person present tense. Because I kind of, I was writing third person limited for a while. The one that I sent you, Infinity's Air, is
Yeah,
third person
yeah,
limited. Um and and it was really really hard because the first draft of that I had to tell so much. And that's bad. You're not supposed to do that. I mean, you're supposed to balance show and tell with a heavy leaning on show, by your
yeah.
word choice. Um, you know, there's probably a lot of people out there who are never going to see this video who are going to be like, "No, no, that's wrong. It's show only, no tell." But for me it took, I mean, I'm still working on it. I started working on this book back in 2015 and I'm still working on it years later because it just doesn't feel
Right.
just right. And I've noticed, I mean, the last the book that I wrote, the cyberpunk I wrote in first person present tense, which I will admit is difficult to get into, but once you get into it, it flows so much easier because I basically, you know, all of my thoughts flow directly from my character, so I don't have to think about the way that I'm going to put it, that my character would interpret it. Like it's just well, I am my character while I'm typing. So
Yeah.
so since I am my character while I'm typing, I just get to say this is basically what's happening or this is how I feel about something. It makes it for me a whole lot easier because and for me it's also a lot more interesting because I can do things that I can't do in third person limited with first person present tense. It sounds lazy. I promise it's not me being lazy.
No.
I've just found that when I write that way, the stuff that I can do and kind of the things that I get to play with, they're different. They're not things that I've thought about doing before as a writer. So it's a lot more exciting for me writing that way than like third person limited because third person limited, I've read so many third person limited books and it kind of comes down to a formula of the way you have to write things for them to flow correctly, you know?
Right.
There's less, and that's what's really interesting about the way that you write is that it is basically third person omniscient. So you get this like kind of interesting flow between the different characters and it's a very subtle flow. So you're reading a paragraph and you're reading from one person's thoughts, and then you kind of have this transition paragraph where you talk about the situation in general, and then the next paragraph are with the other character. But it doesn't feel ham-fisted in any sort of way. It feels like this gentle flow from one character to another, which I think is really interesting because a lot of people don't like third person omniscient because of how ham-fisted it can feel because she feels this way, that person feels that way, and then on top of everything everything's blowing up, and you know it's a difficult thing to do, right? um
And and the thing is like I can't write first person. It's not how my brain processes information, and I'm not sure I could write first person unless I really practice very hard. This is just I would say it's naturally how I think.
mhm
And it could just be reflective of my personality type that makes it easy for me to do this way because I certainly am very cerebral. I am very much a thinking person and not a doing person, um, which has been fun and a challenge at the same time because as with most of our characters, they're chips off of our personality. Uh, and you're very familiar with your own personality. So when you write a character that you're trying to contrast to your own personality, you got to really kind of sit through it, be like, no, 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 that's not going to work.
and I've definitely run into stuff like that when I'm writing before. um and that's why I think that's why for me, because I mean, and we can talk about this in terms of video games, like I like story based single like RPG video games. You know, I mean, you like those kind of games too.
Yeah, sure,
But
yeah,
you're very very good, and you've always been very good since I've known you with like the kind of RTS like Total War type games. Like I can't
yeah.
play those for shit. You can give me an army 5 times bigger than the other person, and they'll still destroy me. You know, because that's not how my brain works. I do tend to work in a very like singular fashion. So when you give me that kind of storyline where I have like one character with a bunch of stuff revolving around the character, I can put all that stuff together. For me, so it makes it easier for me to contrast those other characters when I'm in a single character because I'm like, this is how this character is. Because I found myself when I was writing Infinity's Air, the one that you read, rewriting a lot of conversations and a lot of character interactions because everybody felt really flat. Everybody
Yeah.
felt exactly the same when I first started writing it.
And it was interesting to me because when I read Infinity's Air, I could see the fact that you were trying to put the narrative in the rails of your main character's eyes because you were very good at showing the reader, this is how this character thinks about this character. This is how this character thinks about this character. And that was interesting to me because of your point of view of telling the story. You weren't actually going inside their heads like I do. You were just kind of like showing it.
Yeah, and that's the and I've heard kind of some mixed thoughts of that. Some people really like that, some people don't. But I tend to, you know, I tend to try and drive everything with there's a lot of action in Infinity's Air. And that's on
Yep.
purpose because I tried to when I first told the story, and Infinity's Air is very. I would say that it's like a 92,000 word novel right now, and I would say that probably only 40,000 of the words are the original novel that I wrote back in 2015, because I spent when I was writing it back then, I was writing it like old school fiction because I grew up reading Anne McCaffrey, C.J. Sherry, Marion Zimmer Bradley, Andre Norton, all these like
Yeah.
Ursula K. Le Guin, all these old school, very old school science fiction and fantasy writers. And none of them write, like, no one writes like that anymore. You know,
That's actually a good point. Maybe we could segue into that is uh how the market drives consumer interest, because at the end of the day, while writing is something we do and love, it's a business. Who gets published is based off of what's vogue, and we can certainly see that from spin-offs. Like just today I learned that there's an adult spin-off of Harry Potter called The Magicians, which is essentially
really?
Hogwarts for adults.
Is that like I didn't know. Is it actually attached to Harry Potter? I didn't know it was attached to Harry
It's
Potter.
not. It's a different writer. It's just
Oh,
I looked.
okay.
I was talking to someone. They brought it up, and I
Mhm.
looked it up, and I'm just like, this is something that sells because Harry Potter sold.
Yeah, well, and
Um,
and it's really interesting because like so to segue into something like that, so obviously we're gonna gerbil a little bit, and I guess we're gonna gerbil right into. Sorry, I'm checking our time. We're gonna gerbil right into kind of media, and like you said, it's a business. Like what gets published. And so what's really interesting, and I've queried. I spent the last year querying a YA novel, and it wasn't ready. I know that now. At the time, I was like, this is 100% ready. It's totally ready to go out to agents and all this other stuff. Um, it wasn't ready. And what it comes down to is it comes down to, like you said, what gets published is very different than what used to get published. What I wrote wasn't correct for the current YA market, and that's the thing about all the markets. When you talk about whatever kind of media, whether you talk about books or movies or TV, the kinds of things that sell and the kinds of things that are popular aren't necessarily what and I think a perfect example of this is the last Blade Runner movie that just came out.
oh yeah,
So
that's a good point.
it was in my mind, like, now I will temper this with Blade Runner, the first one is one of my favorite movies of all time. So in my mind, I thought that Blade Runner 2049 was a perfect sequel to the first movie. Absolutely perfect. I don't
But it didn't
think
do well.
it didn't do well at all. It was like
No.
its box office numbers, I think it didn't crack 60 million or something like that. It's probably more than that, but I remember its box office numbers were terrible. For the first weekend, it was like, whoa, this is
Yeah.
really bad. And and then you contrast that with Star Wars, right?
Yeah.
Which the new movies that just came out, um, for some people, very very popular. For other people, it's very polarizing, right? It made a ridiculous amount of money, but as many people hated it as they did liked it, but they still went and saw it. You know,
Right.
they were expecting, the Jedi and the craziness and force using and battles and all this other stuff. You know what we've come to expect from movies
Right.
like that. And
It's a brand. Yeah, it's a brand.
it is brand, but I think a portion of it, and it's also the reason why maybe Rogue One was so popular. I think a portion of it is the type of science fiction and the type of just media that we're consuming, right? When we were younger, uh, like way younger, probably a little bit maybe before our times, you had it was what, V. Remember the sci-fi miniseries V?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
You had what was the other one? It was Earth, I think was the other one. Like there were these more, not to say that no sci-fi nowadays is cerebral. I don't want to say that, but I want to say that like there has been a shift more towards, cuz even when you look at like Star Trek Discovery and stuff like that, there's been a shift away from the thought experiment type science fiction more towards popcorn science fiction. That has been changing recently. I know that there's a lot of really interesting science fiction that's more thought experiment type stuff coming out of China, you know.
Sure, and we actually we talked about this recently, just a couple of days. Is I would not describe The Expanse as a thought experiment, but it is kind of a chip off the block of that old hardcore sci-fi. Its direction is just very reality based. You can look at it and be like, an absurd amount of real world research went into this.
Mhm.
Um, you know, of course, this goes back to brand. One of the writers was actually one of Martin's assistants, and Martin was basically the main reviewer for it that got it popular because it's been sold essentially as Game of Thrones in space.
Uh, well, and I mean, it's funny that you go to Martin because we can segue to this. I don't know if you've heard of the series called Night Flyers.
I have not.
Um, so I didn't know this, and I wanted to mention this. Like Martin got his start in science fiction. Like,
Yeah, he.
and
I've
I
read a
didn't know
couple of his
that.
short stories.
Yeah, and Night Flyers is actually his sci-fi novella that he wrote like back in the 80s. I think he was like in his 50s when he wrote it because he's like almost 80 now or something like that.
Yeah.
So and I think it was the first thing he ever published, Night Flyers, and he was older. He was middle-aged, you know. It's kind of interesting because I was watching Astrid and I were watching Night Flyers, and we always fast forward past the credits. And I'm on episode 2, and I'm watching this and I said, "This must be based on a book, an old book." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because it's got like a 80s sci-fi feel to it." She's like, "What do you mean?" I was like, "It's just like I've read a ridiculous amount of
Yeah,
80s
I could
sci-fi.
feel it. Yeah.
Like it is from the 80s." And then we were watching like just back to back one time and we didn't fast forward through the credits and it said George R. R. Martin. I was like, "What?" I looked it up and it was like 86 or 84 or something like that. I was like, "Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense." Very very 80s sci-fi. So it's kind of interesting, right? How you can see everything shift and you can tell the difference between kind of like timestamps just by kind of watching something for a little bit or even, reading it or looking at it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So I think we're a billion miles off course now.
We are.
Uh, we're
What
way
is a
into
billion
media. We're
miles?
so far away from writing now. I think that from a craft perspective, we've still been hitting all the high notes of everything we wanted to hit. But I do want to kind of pull it back towards writing because I'm sure everyone out there in YouTube land is going, "What are you guys doing? This is terrible." Uh, especially the
Naturally.
people who came here for writing. Um, but back to I want to spend the last little bit kind of focusing on back on writing, back on the process. And so one thing that I definitely want to talk about or have you talk about before we leave is I do want you to talk a little bit more about your process because your process we talked a little bit about like the Planster processing or
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
the Planster um but also even though we're both Plansters and even though you Planst you do have kind of a very exhaustive way of researching. We've talked about
Yes.
this a little bit, and I kind of want you to maybe go into a little bit of detail about it because I think that's a very like what you've described to me is actually a very interesting process, and I think it's very informative from a writing perspective.
Sure. Thanks. I basically look at my world building as a giant research experiment, saying, what do we know today, and how can I scaffold off of that in a way that is not real but believable. I can't remember who said it, but someone out there essentially said that the difference between a good magician and a bad magician is who lies better, and that's essentially what my story building is doing, is building a convincing lie. Giving people just enough to be like, okay, this is real, before I throw them off the deep end. So my book is about fighter pilots, essentially one of the core plots. uh, so I read books written by fighter pilots, which helps. So when I go down to brass tacks and I'm doing this outline, um, if I'm going to write an action sequence, I got to be like, okay, how is a fighter pilot going to look at this versus someone who's not a fighter pilot? Which opens a whole can of worms, because then I have to sit down when I'm outlining and get into that perspective and try and sell it in a way that works. Because strictly speaking, if I was just going to start rambling off a bunch of NATO call signs, people are going to get very boring. People don't want to hear about Fox Alpha Tango.
And there's more
Um,
than enough Tom Clancy books out there to
yeah,
fulfill
sure.
those fantasies if you really want to read about that stuff.
But like I said, it's a little bit of magic. Dabble it here, dabble it there, but have fun with it. So yeah, that definitely goes into it. Like I said, giant research experiment for me.
And you could really and so you could really tell. Like I said before, I've read about 20 chapters of what you sent me, and it's very easy to tell that you do pull from a lot of different places. Not like, oh, he's taking stuff from other places. It's you can tell that there's a lot of thought that's kind of gone into, because you're writing in the future. So your book takes place about what, 700 800 years in the future, and
Yeah,
it's
that
still based on. Sorry, go ahead.
no, no, no. Well, I was actually this is something I'm having to tell myself. This goes back into the whole believable magic thing. I've
Hmm.
actually been on my own case that I probably have to set it a little further in the future because there's some timeline discontinuity um, going on about maybe it being a little too close to our time
Hmm.
for the technology I have present. But anyway, sorry.
And
That's
that's what's really interesting, right? As you can tell, I mean, you write about, obviously it's a human empire in the future, about 700 years right now. So
yeah,
you can tell that you've kind of pulled from the present. You kind of refer to where we've come from to kind of inform where we've been. And in some cases, and I have complained about this, I know, you mentioned like, you know, dentistry and all this other stuff, and I'm like, that feels too present, right?
right.
Um, and I think that's probably a me thing and not a you thing. But I do think that from a general standpoint, I can tell when I read that it's actually firmly grounded in, a lot of books just kind of go, we're over here. Like it's humans, but they're over here. We don't have to inform it on our current
Yeah.
culture and stuff. But you do kind of, your characters do kind of, think about the past, and they do. You have a lot of characters that are very, like, basically intellectually based. You have Wolf, who, warrior culture, so she thinks about her warrior culture, and then she thinks about the past. And then you have your, I cannot remember her name, Cipher 7, Cipher 6.
Yeah, my essentially Tom Clancy spy.
Yeah, so
That's
this person is all about, like, socio-political intrigue, but a lot of that is informed by, Cipher 6 or 7. Is it Cipher 6?
it's Cipher 7. It's a
Cipher
James
7.
Bond
Okay.
reference.
So Cipher 7 actually plays the long game. And, like, we're talking the long game, like 700 years long game. Like, Cipher 7 thinks about, like, where we've been to inform, like, where we currently are. And I think you got a lot going on there that'll all come together when we get to the end. And I'm interested to see where it goes, but you can tell that process of researching and thinking about all of the different little bits that interconnect together has really, like, carefully thought out. Probably, definitely, much more carefully thought out than mine. That's why I write space opera.
Well, actually, that actually does bring up a show I wanted to ask you about. If I know I kept like dropping these comments when I was beta reading your work, and my screensaver just kicked in, where I was beta reading your work, and I was like, oh man, this reminds me of Dan Simmons. This reminds me of this mythology. When you were doing your work on it, did you actually stop and read a book or do some research about Norse or Slavic mythology? Because I could really feel that bleeding through.
So I did. When I first started writing the book, I did not. I want it to be Norse mythology, and I know enough about it and all that other stuff. And so I have, and it's up there. I'm not gonna get up and get it because I'm lazy, because it's way up there. I actually did. I got one of the people I knew that at a company I used to work at said, "Oh, um, you're writing, and I have this book about ancient civilizations." So he gave it to me, and it has a bunch of stuff about Norse mythology in there. I did go and I did a lot of reading about, about the fates and about this and about that. Really kind of, because I wanted it to be Norse mythology, but I didn't want it to feel cheap, like I wasn't
Right.
trying. because one of the
You wanted
biggest
to do it justice.
I did want to do it justice, and I will admit that the first draft did not do it justice. When I was reading it back, I was like, there's no way that I can legitimately say that this has Norse mythology tendencies without actually going back, doing a lot of reading, and then coming back and actually trying my very best to actually really do it justice. And I'm happy that you feel like I did, because I'm not, I'm obviously not a historian by any stretch of the imagination, you know. So and that's what winds up happening with writers, right? Is we start writing about things that we know absolutely nothing about. In my case,
That's
I'm
true.
writing about Norse mythology. I have a friend who's writing a book that's set in France, and he's never been to France. And so there is a lot of research that's involved, and it's funny that you asked that, because I would have said, no, I don't research, I just kind of write. But the
Yeah.
the truth is when you stop and make me think about it, I do go and research, because I do wanna do right by those things, right?
It writing is I mean, I hate to say on your feet, but writing is very much an on your feet process where you have to really learn as you go. Um, I think probably for every, just to mash together time, I think for every hour I'm physically writing, I'm probably spending 2 or 3 hours thinking about what I'm going to write. And that's probably me, but I think it's also true of just writers in general that a lot more thought goes into it than actually comes out.
And I,
Um,
I, I would agree with that sentiment, because I would say that I will sit down and I will write 1,000 words, and I wrote my 1,000 words. But when it comes to when it comes to, like, the when I'm not writing, there are times when I will, it's late and I'm maybe in bed. And I've done this multiple times, and I can't go to sleep because I'm thinking about a story and thinking about a story and thinking about, like, what I need to do next. And when it hits me, I have to get up and I have to go type it. I can't let it rest. I have to go take care of it, because you
I,
spend so much time thinking about the perfect thing to put on the page.
so
Uh,
it's really interesting you should mention that, um, because as I've told you, I've been struggling with ending my book one in a way that it could be an self-contained narrative that's
mhm.
also part of a series. Um, I apparently woke up at about 1 a.m. last night and scribbled an ending on the paper that's a pretty great jawbreaker, and I'm just going to flash it because I don't want anyone to actually see. I may even get this framed, who knows? Um, and it's just pulled everything together so perfectly, and I'm like, that's great. And if writing was a sit down and you're done activity, that would have never have happened.
And that's true. And I mean, and I'll agree with you on that one, because so I made a push to finish. So I wrote a cyberpunk novel last year, the first book that I wrote that had ever gone over 100,000 words. Um, and I wrote 40,000 words, about 45,000 words in November and December last year. I killed it on my word count. But I don't think I'm happy with the end of the story, because I forced it. I was kind of like, it needs, like, this is the final conflict. I need to wrap everything up. I actually remember it was Christmas Eve when I finished it. I was sitting at my father-in-law's dining room table going, I have to finish this. I only have 5 more days. Once Christmas gets here, I'm not going to do anything for the rest of the Christmas break. I have the whole rest of the week off. We're going to be doing nothing.
Yeah.
I'm going out of town. I was going out of town, like, I think 2 or 3 days after Christmas. 2 days after Christmas, I was like, I'm not gonna finish it. So I built it out an ending that is mediocre. It
Yeah,
doesn't
sure.
it doesn't
Doesn't sit well with you.
it really doesn't, and it hasn't. And so I'm gonna, I I've had people beta read the book. No one's actually read the ending yet. The
Oh,
one of the
okay.
person who beta read, he was I had him read the first chapter, because I was like, can you tell me if, because I rewrote the first chapter, and I was like, can you tell me if this is okay? And I just shared with him the Google Doc of the full novel, and he just
Okay.
didn't stop reading. So it became this like rat race where I was like, I have to keep ahead of you. So I'm sitting here like typing, oh my goodness, I gotta. So I kept ahead, and then he caught up with me. He caught up with me, and then he just never got to the last chapter or two. So I know Jason will probably take a look at this, and if he gets to this part of the video, it's finally done, so you can read it now, bro.
um, it, so everyone has a side in this whole word choice today. I know Twitter certainly treats word count as kind of like the end all quota. I'm not a big fan of word count. I get why word count's important because you can't sit and wait for inspiration because inspiration is maybe there 5% of the time. I'm a firm believer in time. I would much rather sit down in, the hour I write and spit out 300 words than spit out. I think the most I've ever written in one day is like 3,000. Then spit out 3,000. Come back the next day, review it, and go, "This is all trash," because it's wasted time at that point.
And I'll agree with you to a point. I've gotten to the point where I won't review my work until I'm done with it.
Yeah.
The only way that I'll review my work is if I've taken such a long break that I don't remember where I left off. But past that, because I used to do that. I used to review. I would write a chapter, because when I first started writing, I didn't use Google Docs. I would draft a chapter in a draft email and then email it to myself.
I still do that to keep an electronic copy circulating in case in case there's like ever an EMP or something like that.
Yeah.
Goes off and destroys.
Yeah. So I used to do that, and I used to reread the chapters after I'd send them, and then go and make edits and stuff like that. But what I do now is I will go through the entire thing. I'll only read to remind myself of where I've been, and then I'll finish it. And because for me, I will never get through something if I go back and I'll revise it, because I'll revise and go, oh, I need to change this. This chapter needs to be written, blah, 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 blah. And I would rather take longer on the revision process
than the writing process.
And that's not because I don't care about my writing. That's because sometimes I am very German. Everything needs to be perfect.
Yeah.
So it's kind of one of those, like, if I go back and I review it, I'm gonna rewrite, and then I'm just gonna get into this loop of I'm stuck on this one chapter.
And Brian Sanderson, the author, the Wheel of Time guy, he had a interesting. It wasn't a podcast, a video he did, where he essentially outlined that there's a couple of different types of writers when it comes to the writing/revision process. Someone like me who writes so structurally and so intensely that when it comes time to revise, there's not actually a whole ton of revision to be done. He calls those people like planters, as in like letting something grow. Whereas he calls the people that want to get it out the door and then come back when it's done as architects, which is kind of interesting to me, considering the terminology. But there are certainly, just as there are different perspectives to writing, there are different ways or different avenues writers prefer, to getting a story out there, and there's no real correct path.
And I think that's what's really interesting, is that you'll go and read about these writers, and there will be some people who do 50 billion storyboards. I mean, you've seen them. Like, if you follow them on Twitter, they post these insane, like, you remember this, like, New York Times bestseller? Check out the storyboards for this thing. And it's like 40 pages of like this super intense storyboards, and then you have some people who are just like, yeah, I just like, pooed that out on a page and then edited a few times, and it's totally good.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting. Now, for me, I don't know if that's ever gonna lead to traditional publishing. It might not even lead to small house publishing. I don't know. I mean, I would hope that one day something that I write is good enough to actually get out there and maybe get on store shelves. I mean, I'd love to be like Neil Gaiman and go sneaking into bookstores and sign copies of my book.
Yeah.
To leave for other people to find, because I mean, I think the idea of it's kind of one of those, it's kind of one of those things where being a writer, you know, you can write for yourself. And
Yeah.
obviously, we're all writing for ourselves. But there's nothing more there's nothing more just kind of awesome than writing for yourself and then sharing it with someone and having someone go, "That's super awesome." And I
Yeah,
think that's what we all
absolutely.
want, you know.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, my whole MO, going into this story is I knew from the very beginning um, that I wanted it to be a story with a happy ending because I am one of those miserable people that is fed up with the fact that like every other show produced is like dystopian. Um, it's almost like our society has forgotten how to believe in good endings. So while a whole bunch of bad shit happens in my book, I yeah,
Demonetized.
yeah, I'm gonna bring the characters out on the other side. And it's because I want to give people a book that you know. Oh, they've had a bad day at work. Oh, they lost their job. Whatever. They can read the book and then they're like, they can get up the next day and do it just because maybe it's something I said. And that
Yeah.
that really keeps me going when I stop believing in the story myself because it's like this could change someone's life.
Yeah, and that's the thing, and I think you're right about. So I really resonate with what you said about happy endings. I don't think I've written a book that's had a sad ending. I've always written books that have hopeful endings, or this is the start of something new. Um,
Yeah.
Maybe I've watched way too much anime, you know, and I've gotten into this kind of slice of life ending type thing almost, where, because you saw it with Infinity's Heir is, I could have ended it at the last chapter, but I felt like the epilogue was something that.
The epilogue was good. I really felt that the epilogue contributed a lot to the story, and it would have been a disservice to have not included it.
And then and see, I've struggled with that a lot, to be perfectly honest. Is I could have I thought really long and hard about whether I wanted to end it because the ending was just like the journey is over, everything's kind of fine, for the most part. There's still issues that other books could be written about with other characters, but kind of what I really wanted to do was, the whole story is about this one dude's quest to kind of like, the enemy comes down, messes up everything, and then his quest is to put everything back again. You know,
Yeah.
he's been doing it for 1,000 years. He might as well do it one more damn time. You know, and you see a lot of maybe he doesn't really believe anymore, maybe the magic is gone type thing, once he kind of figures out what's going on, maybe I should stop doing this because I've been doing it for so long, what's the point,
Right.
you know but I really wanted to reinforce that the whole point of the epilogue is like hope is still there, he still believes stronger than ever, and he's going to continue for however long he wants. And that's the thing, I agree with you. I think positive endings are what everybody needs right now. I think, with the way the world's going, with the way the country's going, with the way all of this media is going. You see all these stories, like I think Red Dead Redemption, the first game, is a perfect example of like, obviously, I don't know if you've played the game.
I have not, but I
Okay.
think I probably know.
So, if you haven't played Red Dead Redemption by now, and you don't want the ending to be spoiled, go away. Go away. But basically, you get the main character throughout the entire game. It's basically a story of redemption. Like he does everything he can to like get out of his old life, because it's like the third game in the series. I never played the first two, but the whole game is about redemption. And at the very end of the game, they come for him, and he gets shot and killed. It's a very like and like he's got a son. Like the whole game, like he like once he the first quarter of the game or something like that, he can't go home because he's out, working for like redeeming his soul basically for all the
Yeah.
bad stuff that he did. And then at a certain point, he gets to go back to his home and like he's having a positive relationship with his son. He's turning his life around. Everything's going. And then they come for him at the very end, and you're like, really? This is super depressing. And then his son, who he was basically like the whole game, he's like, you don't want to be like me. You want to be better. And then the epilogue of that game is his son turned into his dad. He's an
Of course.
outlaw criminal type thing. So it's like this really, I get what you're saying, and it was a very poignant story, and I really liked it, and I thought it was really good. But yeah, I kind of miss. I really do miss the positive endings because so many, even games, it's in everything. It's in TVs and it's in games. There's a lot of the hope is gone, and I think
Yeah.
that, you know,
And someone somewhere pointed out to me it's because good endings are hard to do. I've turned that over in my head a little bit. Um, and I think the reason that we think good endings are hard to do is just like you said, because it's reflective of the state of mind of our general society. It's because people don't necessarily believe in good endings anymore. And perhaps as writers, as artists, it's kind of our job to bring that back.
yeah, and I want to see more of that, and I mean, you see some of that. You see some good things here and there, but yeah, I think, I hope anyway, that we'll start to see a trend of going in that direction. I know you and I, talking about our works here, it seems like we're both going in that direction. I like writing happy endings. Like I said, I haven't really written anything with a sad ending. I don't really plan on writing anything with a sad ending right now. I'm not that
Oh,
depressed yet.
there's plenty of sad in the story, but it's what I call a learning sad.
Yeah,
It's there to teach a lesson and not necessarily just be there to evoke a response.
it's not disaster porn.
No, it's not
Yeah,
disaster porn.
yeah, and that's another thing that I've seen a lot of lately too is you get a lot of that, right? You get the sadness, you get disaster porn, which is for the uninitiated, it's basically gore and depression and pessimism for the sake of gore and depression and pessimism and literally nothing else. There's no redeeming quality of why it's there other than to be as depressing as humanly possible.
To be shocking, yeah,
Yes, yeah,
it's a shock factor.
yeah, and that's all it's there for, and a lot of that feeds into a terrible ending, right? Um, and there's not much else to be said about it.
Yeah.
I think we're almost done.
Okay.
Um, I say that you might have a lot of more stuff to talk about, but I did want to open it up to you for anything that you want to say, that you want to ask, that you want to cover that we haven't covered yet, because I have dominated the conversation. Uh,
Uh, sure. This is I might get my own answer asking this question. Why writing and not playing ukulele? Both you and I have played guitar. Um, so at what point did you sit down and be like, I'm setting aside this other hobby to focus on this one? Because there's always got to be some critical moment that pushes you over the edge.
So mine is actually kind of, there's a lot of probably cheese in it. I was playing music for a while, like you said, and I played a lot, and I have another YouTube channel with music up on it, and blah 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 blah. We've all done it, but what really kind of turned it for me was, I was going through a really rough time in my life. A lot of things were changing that I never expect to change. They were changing in ways I never expect them to change. And so what wound up happening is that you spend a lot of time sitting at home alone. You have a lot of thoughts in your head. You think about a lot of things, right? You can only play so much guitar and music, and you can only play so many video games before, and even watch TV and watch movies and all this other stuff before you're just alone and
Right.
you're thinking about stuff. And so I had a certain, like, basically, thoughts popped into my head, certain thoughts, basically thoughts that fed into, like, the first trilogy that I wrote, and I was really bad at writing, and I knew I was really bad at writing, and I didn't really have a goal. I wasn't trying to get published. I wasn't trying to really do anything. It was just kind of a cathartic outlet, you
Sure.
know. Um, and I got about 250,000 words in before I actually realized, oh, I do enjoy this, so yeah, it took 250,000 words of concerted effort and really, really shitty writing to realize that I'm not bad at it. Well,
Right.
I'm not published, so I'm bad at it. But
Well, I'm not sure. I think we agreed earlier that publication is not necessarily the end all metric of
yeah,
great
yeah,
art.
I'm not in the top like 5% or whatever, the top less than 1% of writers. But I enjoy doing it. Um, I enjoy doing it. It was basically a cathartic experiment turned into a long-term goal. And I've gotten to the point where when I don't do it, I feel kind of bad because I feel like I'm wasting talent, right? I'm not a
Right.
great guitar player. Like I can write music and stuff, but I'm not a good guitar player, not really. It's fun to dabble, but I feel like my skill at writing far eclipses my skill at playing guitar. That
Yeah,
doesn't
sure,
mean I
it's where you
won't.
belong.
I mean, it doesn't mean I won't pick up my guitar and play it and stuff like that. But at the same time, I feel like even if I never get published, I would be a worse human being for not writing the stories that I've written.
Yeah, absolutely. And, this is like I said when I asked you the question. I was pretty sure you were going to answer the same way I did, is because started writing for a similar reason. 2018 starting April was a very very bad year for me, um, and I started having thoughts in my head about stuff loosely related to a story, and then finally I started sitting down in June and getting serious about it. Um, so yeah, very very similar uh, situation.
And I, and
Um,
and I think it's a good outlet for this kind of stuff. Sitting down and writing, it always starts, or a lot of the time it starts as pain, or it starts as thoughts that just won't leave your head, and spitting them out onto
right.
a page is a good way of kind of assuaging these feelings that you have, or these thoughts or doubts, or make your characters deal with them. It's like an interesting way of fighting your own demons, right?
Sure, sure. You can project it onto your characters. You can see how your characters deal with it. I wouldn't necessarily say I've necessarily learned anything from my characters, um, but seeing how my characters interact with each other has been helpful for me on some days. Kind of like that little angel that sits on your shoulder and is be like, you're gonna be okay.
hmm
Um, so I had another question, and you kind of touched on this earlier. You said that you kind of like defaulted to space opera. Um, is there really any particular reason why you would choose to set yourself within that genre?
Yes. um. So I have never really been a fan of fantasy. You know, crucify me all you like. The only fantasy novel. So I've read The Lord of the Rings twice. I read it
Okay.
when I was really young, and I read it when I was older. When I was really young, it blew my mind. When I was older, not so much. I still enjoyed it, but it wasn't the same level of enjoyment as when I was really young, because I think that and I'm a scientist. Like, I went to school to be a scientist. I have a
Right.
degree. I have a BS. You know, so it's kind of one of those things where you know, and I read like 80 Star Wars books when I was a kid. Of the novelizations and stuff. So where my stories and ideas and everything really fell, and it's always fallen more on the side of science fiction. And realistically, the first trilogy that I wrote probably wouldn't be described as a space opera. It's probably more of like a interdimensional science fiction story. Infinity's Air is the only real space opera that I've written.
Right.
I like space opera. Um, it's not all I'm going to write. My current novel that I'm writing would probably be considered hard sci-fi.
Okay.
And then I wrote cyberpunk. So I write science fiction. I'm firmly in the realm of science fiction. Um, I say space opera because I love the idea of playing with aliens and like magical realms and all the other stuff, like all together, right? And
Right.
all of my favorite movies are basically space operas, for the most part. I mean, but my two main genres will for the long term will likely be cyberpunk and space opera. Um,
And I I've actually struggled to put my current work in progress inside a genre, um, because it draws from so many elements. I mean, it is certainly set in the future.
Mhm.
It certainly involves space. Um, there's certainly some surrealism in it that kind of borders on fantasy.
Mhm.
Um, that really so far floats beneath the surface. But there's a huge psychological component to it.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, and
that
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
you know so the reason I ask that is, is there something you think space opera does particularly well compared to just hard sci-fi? A comparison being, what is, a Volvo versus a Chevrolet kind of analogy.
So for me, for space opera specifically, so I'll talk about it in terms of just the different genres. So if I were to write hard sci-fi, I wouldn't get the leeway of, so I'll talk about Infinity's Air specifically because it's
Okay.
it's the space opera. If I were to write it as a hard sci-fi, I wouldn't get iron warships going through space. You know, I would have to talk a little bit more about, you know, the ships themselves. I would have to justify their propulsion method. I would have to justify, you know, just so many things that you don't
Right.
necessarily have to justify in hard sci-fi. Hard sci-fi is just that. It is hard sci-fi. If you want a perfect example of hard sci-fi, look at The Martian. It is science fiction, but it is hard sci-fi. It is research to a T. It is very, 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 because when you think about it, a lot of people like to say, and I know I'm segueing, I'm not even finishing my thought, but Star Trek is not hard sci-fi.
No.
Star Trek is space opera. And a lot of
Yeah.
people like to go, you say hard sci-fi and people go Star Trek. And I'm like, no, Star Trek is not hard sci-fi. You know, Star Trek is, when you talk about, the warp bubble and like subspace and like, the like all of these different crazy things that they come up with, like if you can invent something to explain an anomaly, that's basically, for all intents and purposes, that's space opera. Space opera lets
Right.
you invent the science fiction and doesn't request that you explain it. Star Wars is another perfect example. Jump to light speed. How do you do it? We don't care. Just jump to light speed. Like it's all that. Go to warp. How do you do that? We have a warp core with antimatter. You know,
Yeah.
powered by dilithium. What's dilithium? Doesn't matter. That's what powers our warp bubbles. Like, and that's what's really great for me about that kind of thing. Like writing Cyberpunk was really different. I had to ground it in a real world. I didn't get to mess around and kind of like I got to make everything up, but everything had to be believable. You know,
So you think actually it maybe actually takes more effort to write science fiction that's not a space opera because you have to go into these
I
details?
think that hard science fiction is much more difficult to write. I think because you are required, or you're not required, but the science fiction itself insists upon you being as realistic as possible. I mean, take you mentioned The Expanse earlier. You know, I haven't read the books. I've started watching the show, and everything is very, very meticulously planned out. Like all of the technologies, all of the way that things work, all of the way that they go through space travel, like all of this different stuff. Like it's much more meticulously planned out than say something like Star Wars or Star Trek or even The Fifth Element. When you think about it, in The Fifth Element they go from one place to another and they don't really talk about how they get there. Oh, we're going to jump, you know.
Yeah.
But in The Expanse, I mean, in the first episode, like doing hard burn. They do a hard burn in the first episode of the show, and it's a process, and it's a very kind of like it's a process and a procedure, and it has to be done perfectly, and everybody's wearing like mouthpieces and all this other crazy stuff. You know, it
Okay.
you have to be a very special kind of person to write hard sci-fi well because it insists that you are a scientist and everything is absolutely perfect.
Okay. Yeah.
For me, like.
Yeah, a form of internal consistency, so to speak.
Well, and external, because when you think about stuff like The Martian wouldn't have worked if it was wishy-washy
Yeah, that.
with the way it was presented. You know, Andy Weir did a ridiculous amount of research for that book. I mean, I've read, like, he went and talked to NASA scientists about it. You know, he spent time, he put in work, and I mean, he deserves it. I read the book; it was amazing, but it also felt very plausible. Like, I feel like if I were trapped on Mars, I could have that book with me, and maybe, I mean, I would die, obviously, but maybe I wouldn't die as quickly if I had The Martian with me, right? So
Right. So how are we doing on time?
we are hour and a half ish.
Okay.
So we are kind of far along. So I think we should probably think about wrapping it up for tonight. That being said,
Okay.
I think that this conversation leaves more than enough room for another episode at some point in the future, even maybe like a quarterly thing.
Yeah, sure.
I do think that this is helpful. I hope that anyone who is watching who decided to stick with this for this long finds it useful as well. Maybe anyone out there who has questions or certain things they would like to discuss or have us discuss can leave a message in the comments below. Tell us what you think. But for now, I think we'll go ahead and end it. Bracken, thank you so much for spending this time with me.
Oh, sure.
Taking a lot of time out of your evening to record this. And we'll be back at some point in the future with another topic. And for now, I'll just say bye-bye.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right. Have a good night, sir, and we'll see you guys next time.
All right, bye.
Bye.